The year is 1896, and as the locals would say, that's the year that the gates to hell were opened. Hey guys, my name is AJ, this is Denise and Allie. Welcome to the adventure we call life.
Get along down the road, we got a long, long way to go. Scared to live, scared to die. We ain't perfect, but we try. Get along while we can. Always give love the upper hand. Paint a wall, learn to dance. Call your mom, buy a boat.
The history of Brushy Mountain, though, starts decades before 1896, when this area was actually a coal mine that originated in the wake of a bloody labor battle. The end of the Civil War led to a boom in railroad construction and the rapid expansion of the coal mining industry throughout Tennessee. Because many of the state's coal veins were located in such remote areas, most mining companies provided housing by collecting rent from miners' wages. When those companies opened on-site stores selling food, clothes, and other necessities at highly inflated prices, already poor workers piled up debt. By the time their debt and rent was paid, they had little to show for the meager wage job which was working in dangerous conditions. The Coal Creek miners were clever, though, holding strikes in the wintertime when coal demand was high. This tactic worked until a new convict lease program gave companies a cheaper, more compliant workforce. The prison lease system was adopted throughout the South mainly because state governments couldn't afford to build and maintain prisons or feed or shelter and clothe the inmates, and a convict lease program cut costs and brought in money. Beyond that, officials could exploit the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery but allowed involuntary servitude for criminal punishment. Tennessee began the leasing program for prisoners in 1866, and by 1891, the Tennessee coal mine in Anderson County had adopted the practice. This fateful decision, however, led to the Coal Creek War, where citizen miners attacked and burned the state prison, stockades, and mines, then loaded the prisoners and the guards alike onto a train and headed them out of town. Mining companies sent them back, and state officials called in troops for protection. When months of small armed skirmishes led the dead men on both sides, officials realized the cost of maintaining a standing militia undercut any financial gains, and as convict lease contracts expired, legislation passed to construct the state's first maximum security prison. Welcome to Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. By 1896, inmates were building an on-site railroad spur as well as the original wooden prison structure with their own hands. Between the ongoing violence, the deadly mining accidents, and chronic illness, life inside Brushy was precarious to say the least. Diseases were rampant, including tuberculosis, typhoid fever, pneumonia, syphilis, all of which affected nearly 3/4 of the prison's population. Beyond generally poor medical care and treatment, inmates were routinely beaten for underproducing in the mines despite their dire health conditions, and many died as a result. By 1931, Brushy housed 976 men, roughly 300 more than what its original capacity was for. Overcrowding was so prevalent and persistent it drew comparisons to conditions inside the infamous Siberian prisons of the Soviet Union. The state's answer was simple. Plans were drawn for a new structure to be made of reinforced concrete, and they made convicts break sandstone out of the nearby quarry to build a new prison. Constructed in the shape of a Greek cross, it stood 4 stories high, boasted battlements atop it, and by 1934 was surrounded by an 18-foot stone wall. For a moment, things got better. The new prison was safer, more sanitary, and built in the shape of a cross, offering inmates a narrow path to redemption. And going in may never be seen again. What does it say? Look.
Thank you. You too.
No ghost hunting during normal.
No, hold on. Yeah, on this point, so start cutting.
Well, 113 years it was in operation? Holy cow.
That's a long.
Anyone entering or exiting the prison first passed through this small, narrow section of hallway, which is where the general administration offices as well as the warden's office was housed. Once they passed through that locked gate, they came into this section, which is where central control was housed. This is where the guards would pass off any weapons that they carried in or out through the prison, as no guard was allowed to exit the prison carrying a weapon, and they could not enter the prison carrying a weapon. Once they proceeded past that, all visitors and convicts alike then proceeded through what was called the trapped gates. This small section of the prison had a gate that was locked on each side and manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Convicts and visitors both were housed in this cell for a full shakedown, where they would be checked for contraband anytime they were entering the prison, as well as when they were exiting the prison. There were no visitors allowed beyond this cell right here, and any convict that proceeded past this cell would then pass through another locked door as well as another locked gate, which was manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Once the prisoner proceeded through this locked gate, they were truly walking through the gates of hell. With the modern-day prison being built out of stone and concrete in the shape of a cross, it essentially housed 4 wings or blocks coming off the central location point in the middle of the prison. Each of these blocks was identical and symmetrical in that they housed rows and rows of cells along one side of the walkway, with the opposite side of the walkway being open from the floor to the top of the 4th floor. At the end of each of these blocks was a central shower facility which would house 3 inmates at a time. Each cell was designed to hold 2 inmates with bare minimum necessities, although during the coal mining days each cell actually housed 4 inmates, with 2 being on a 12-hour work shift and 2 being on a 12-hour rest shift. Whether it was an oversight or simply forgotten, there was one fatal flaw in building a prison that was 4 stories tall. Originally, remember, one side of the walkway housed all the cells, the opposite side of the walkway was open from ground level to the 4th level. Many an inmate found this out to be a fatal flaw as they became victims of what was called the dead drop. Whether they were being used as an example or simply a vendetta against them for not complying in one way or another, many an inmate found out what it was like to be part of the dead drop. Engineers and construction workers had to go in later on and cage all the way from the ground up to the 4th floor directly across from the cells, as there were too many inmates that were becoming part of the infamous dead drop. Located directly central to the 4 wings and on the 2nd floor of the prison is where the kitchen and dining facilities were located. Dining times for the minimum and maximum security inmates were at complete total different times so as to avoid any cross-contamination between the 2 levels of prisoners. They were never in the dining room nor the hallways at the same time. Brushy Mountain was notoriously the most violent prison in the country. The warden enacted a program where he would allow inmates to paint the walls in the dining rooms with pictures of what they may have remembered the outside free world being like, or places that they would much rather be. After the program was enacted, the violence level actually did go down at the prison, as they thought it brought peace and solitude among the inmates while they were dining. The following murals were all painted by inmates during their time at Brushy Mountain. Throughout its 113 years of operation, Brushy Mountain definitely housed its fair share of famous inmates. From serial killers to serial rapists, many a man had made his way into the walls of Brushy Mountain. However, there were several notable that tried to make their way out of Brushy Mountain. One of those being James Slagle. Now, James was serving a 318-year sentence, and well, he spent about a year of his time here studying yoga and contortionism. Before it was over with, James managed to squeeze himself into two 18 by 9 inch cardboard boxes that were taped together and labeled as roast beef. He promptly rode straight out the prison gates on the back of a flatbed truck, busted out of the cardboard boxes, headed off into the woods, where he was literally immediately spotted by an off-duty guard who was rabbit hunting. Now, another quite notable escape artist was old Donald Kaler. Now, we'll talk more about him in just a minute, but Donald was very famous as he actually jumped the prison walls. Well, not jumped, he actually climbed up a ladder over the prison wall with 6 additional inmates. Now, let's see if something ran in the family here, because apparently old Donald's brother Frankie Kaler was also serving time here at the same time. Now, old Frankie almost pulled off the near-perfect con job. You see, he commandeered a guard's uniform, managed to slide between the bars and the trap gates, shimmied his way through the commissary window, where he promptly waited reading a newspaper wearing sunglasses and a guard's hat. At shift change, he simply walked right out the front door with the rest of the guards and made his way to freedom. Only problem was, as soon as he made it out the front gate, he was greeted by the guard that was coming on duty that was actually in charge of Frankie's cell block. Talk about bad timing and bad luck. Well, apparently it ran in the family. Now, inarguably to me, probably the most infamous inmate of all times was James Earl Ray. Now, if you don't recognize the name James Earl Ray, well, he is the man who allegedly assassinated Martin Luther King Jr. Now, James Earl Ray, well, he was a different sort of breed. He insisted on his innocence, but hey, what inmate doesn't, right?
Everybody's innocent in here. Don't you know that?
But I'm no conspiracy theorist here, but let me share a story with you that James Earl Ray swore up until the day he died was true. Upon being arrested, he simply confessed. No lawyer, no nothing. When he went to court and was arraigned and found out he was going to be serving life in prison, well, his story abruptly changed very quickly, and he insisted that this was all a conspiracy against him put on by the United States government. See, he claimed that the government actually hired him to assassinate Martin Luther King Jr. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. You can make up your own opinions about it based on what you know of today. But James Earl Ray spent his entire career here at Brushy Mountain insisting that if he ever got out, that he would be able to prove his innocence. Now, he was housed in cell number 28, and by all accounts from all prison personnel, he was labeled as a model inmate. He never caused trouble, he never got into trouble, and well, he was very literally a very calm man. But His story never wavered not one time during his stay here at Brushy Mountain while he was insisting upon his innocence. Now, you remember old Donald Kaler that I mentioned earlier about escaping with 6 other inmates? Well, the actual inmate that was escaping was James Earl Ray, and Donald Kaler happened to be one of the additional 6 inmates that managed to go up over the wall. You see, James Earl Ray had gotten together with a group of inmates, and well, they actually built him a ladder, and while they distracted the guards, they popped the ladder up against the wall right here in the very back corner of Brushy Mountain, and old James Earl Ray and 6 other inmates went right up over the top of the wall and managed to make their way out of the valley that Brushy Mountain was in. Now, James Earl Ray definitely promptly became the FBI's most wanted. I don't remember correctly, but I think it was 72 hours that he was actually on the run, and I think he made his way all the way up near London, Kentucky. Again, maintaining his innocence that if he could ever get out, he would be able to prove it. Now, he promptly made his way back to Brushy Mountain, where they tacked on a whole bunch of additional years, and he served out the rest of his time. Again, mentioning that he actually was a model inmate. He was actually stabbed 22 times by 4 other inmates, and he managed to survive. Now, up until the day he died, he swore still of his innocence, that this was all part of a government conspiracy to have Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated. James Earl Ray finally did get out of Brushy Mountain Prison, though. Well, unfortunately, though, it was because he was transferred to a Nashville Correctional Hospital, where he spent out his last time suffering from liver disease. James Earl Ray again promised Dr. King's son that he was an innocent man shortly before he passed away in April of 1998. No evidence ever emerged to prove his claim, and since his passing, well, I guess we'll never know. But like I say, I'm no conspiracy theorist, so you can draw your own conclusions and make your own decisions based on what we know of today as to whether or not James Earl Ray was all part of a government conspiracy. When Brushy opened in 1896, the Hole housed the most disobedient and the most dangerous of the inmates for days, weeks, sometimes even months at a time. The Hole wasn't just about solitary confinement, though, being held in a 6x3 space. It was far, far worse than that. Inhabitants were once treated to what was called suspension torture. They were tied by their thumbs to pulley cords hanging from the ceiling, their toes barely touching the ground, for up to 30 minutes at a time. This went on until approximately 1905, when the practice was deemed inhumane by the State Senate Commissionary Panel. While the size of the Hole was increased to 4x8 when the new prison opened in 1933, it was still a dreadfully dark dungeon containing just a mattress and 2 buckets, one for fresh water and one, well, I'm sure you can imagine what the other one was for. With little ventilation, no heat, no air conditioning, being in the Hole truly was being in the pits of hell. It was so dark in the Hole that once the cell door was closed, it would take just a matter of days before the inmates would lose their vision. After being released from the Hole, it would sometimes take weeks for their vision to be fully restored. If the inmates spent more than a month in the Hole, sometimes their vision would never actually fully restore at all. The warden, however, was not a heartless man for any convict serving time in the Hole. Many times in the middle of the night, he would go down and visit with the inmates strictly to check on their well-being and assure them that they were going to be okay. Though not nearly soon enough for many a suffering man, the old Hole was finally shut down in the 1960s. With the looming shutdown of the Hole, construction began in 1957 for the new D-Block maximum isolation cell quarters. This was going to house the prison's most difficult and deadliest of inmates. Dubbed the New Hole, D-Block maximum security residents had more restrictions placed on them than inmates living on death row in nearby Nashville, Tennessee. Prisoners were stripped of all privileges and possessions except their uniform and bedding. In reality, D-Block was not a hole at all. It was just a smaller version of blocks A and B with 4 walks housing 8 single cells on each walk. The blocks had triple locks to prevent access to the other 3 walks. Despite the high security measures, D Block remained a constant site of violence and bloodshed until the new high security annex building opened on the hill in 1969. Residents of D Block were in complete total isolation 23 hours a day, with just 1 hour a day given to them to be outside, again in a total isolation cell completely by themselves. Each inmate was shackled from their hands to their waist to their feet to allow minimum movement while being transported from the inside of D Block to the outside of D Block. With the violence level being so high among the inmates here in D Block, minimum interaction was always used to help try and keep the violence at the lowest level possible. Ideally, only one inmate was allowed to be outside of their cell at any one time while transferring from inside to outside, or vice versa. The most legendary of any visitor to ever grace Brushy Mountain probably was the most unlikely thing you would ever think of. See, it would be Geronimo. Geronimo was a baby fawn deer that had actually been found by a guard after it fell from a ledge into the yard. Despite his tendency to alert officials to illicit activity by huddling over the convicts while they were playing craps, Geronimo was a beloved compadre in the 1960s, and the prison looked after him for years. With a known affinity for cigarette butts, orange slices, and lifesavers, Geronimo felt right at home inside the walls of Brushy Mountain. He was reportedly found napping in a prison cell at one time, and well, they would even let him dine in the cafeteria. It was said by the guards that they would never dream of releasing Geronimo back into the wild because the inmates would most likely riot in protest. Brushy Mountain Penitentiary officially closed its doors with the last inmate being transferred on June the 11th, 2009 to the Morgan County Correctional Complex. In 2018, Brushy Mountain, however, was revitalized and opened to the public for tours, private events, car shows, and concerts, also becoming home to the Brushy Mountain Distillery. Located nearby atop Frozen Head Mountain is an artesian-fed spring that Brushy Mountain utilizes in all of their production facility processes. This clean artesian-fed water is what Brushy Mountain utilizes to distill their own line of vodka, which is called Frozen Head, as well as their double-barrel whiskey. Also distilled on-site is straight from the still moonshine, as well as a large selection of flavored shines as well. We rounded out our day with a stop by the Warden's Table Chow Hall. We found the menu to be quite diverse, and there should be some kind of cuisine that would cover most anyone's taste. It's hard to believe that this prison shut down for inmates in 2009. Through the blink of time and the history of time, this is merely only yesterday. We thoroughly enjoyed our visit here. We found it quite informative, and the history of the area, well, that's it. It's just history. It's amazing the life and times that these folks went through here. Brushy Mountain, deemed the most notoriously violent prison in the country at the time, has closed its doors and long been shut down. If you ever find yourself in the Petros, Tennessee area, population 503, be sure and make a stop at the Brushy Mountain Penitentiary.